Hi, this is Bill, and this is Progpaganda. Over the course of the last several episodes on this channel, we've been counting down the 25 proto-prog albums, the 25 albums that we selected from the late 1960s that influenced the rise of the genre that we today call progressive rock. We, in the first episode in this sequence, identified the 25 albums in the list in detail and provided the criteria through which we selected the 25 albums. If you haven't seen that episode yet, you can check that out here at this link. We also have done about 10 episodes covering about half of the albums on the list, starting in early 1965 and continuing through 1966 and 67. Feel free to check those episodes out. We think you'll enjoy what you find there. Certainly if you enjoy this one, go back and check those out as well. Today's episode reviews an album released very late in 1967. It's the debut album by Traffic called Mr. Fantasy. The story of Traffic really begins with the story of the Spencer Davis Group and Steve Winwood. Steve Winwood, when the Spencer Davis Group first came to prominence in 1965, was a 16-year-old prodigy who was touted in the press as Birmingham's answer to Ray Charles. He had a wonderful voice that was very suited to R&B music, and the Spencer Davis Group and the band's producers at Island Records put that to great use. The Spencer Davis Group were in fact the first white rock and roll band signed to the Island label. Chris Blackwell, a white Jamaican who had by this time expatriated to England, started Island Records in 1959, primarily focusing on reggae music. But he began in earnest looking for rock bands to promote in 1965, and the Spencer Davis Group was the first one he signed and actually put to vinyl. Blackwell initially marketed the Spencer Davis Group to Atlantic Records in the United States and released 2 singles with the band through Atlantic's Atco subsidiary. These 2 songs, while they were fairly popular in the UK, did not have any action in the United States, and Atlantic dropped the band. Blackwell repurposed the band with United Artists Records in California. And it was there that the Spencer Davis Group had their first and really only 2 American hits, Give Me Some Lovin' in late 1966 and I'm a Man in early 1967. By this time, Winwood was beginning to burn out. He felt somewhat constrained by the band's being forced into an R&B mold. He enjoyed singing the R&B, but at the same time felt he was capable of a lot more, both from a vocal perspective and also as a composer. The band's producer at this time, the American Jimmy Miller, agreed, and Winwood set out looking for opportunities outside of the Spencer Davis Group. He found the band he was looking for in 3 other gentlemen from Birmingham, 2 from one band, Jim Capaldi and Dave Mason, and 1 from another band, Chris Wood. And it was these 4, Winwood on vocals, guitar, and keyboards, Dave Mason on vocals and guitar, Jim Capaldi on vocals and drums, and Chris Wood on various woodwinds, that formed Traffic in April 1967. Traffic went to work quickly. The band, with producer Jimmy Miller, went into the studio almost immediately upon forming, and within about 6 weeks of the band's formation, had their first single in the stores in the UK, the single Paper Sun. Paper Sun would also be released in the United States in the latter part of the summer of 1967. Paper Sun was a beautiful piece with a very distinctive riff played on the sitar by Dave Mason. And it was a song that was very difficult to get out of your head once you heard it. Despite that, however, it wasn't a huge hit in the United States. Radio programmers didn't really know what to do with it. And more to the point, I think some radio programmers, while they were drawn to give initial airplay to the song because of Steve Winwood's connection to the Spencer Davis Group, weren't particularly thrilled with his new direction from a commercial perspective. So the song wasn't a huge hit in the United States. But regardless of that, the band, along with Miller, went ahead very quickly to get an album together. Almost from the beginning, the band split into two factions. The initial thinking, according to Winwood, was that the band would compose and put songs together as a team. And to that point, most of the song's lyrics came from Jim Capaldi, who then would provide them to Winwood, to Wood, and Mason to get a proper structure around them. Very soon into this process, Mason decided that instead of participating in songwriting with the other two, that he would work on songs on his own. This was a source of frustration for the other members of the band, particularly for Steve Winwood, who viewed that Dave Mason wasn't very much of a team player here. It also caused two different strains of music to come from the band. The music composed by Capaldi, Winwood, and Wood was very loose in style, almost jazz flavored. Some could call it the beginnings of a jam band trend. And indeed, on quite a few of Traffic's later albums, we would see songs released that contained very lengthy solo sections. Probably the most notable of those is their 1971 masterpiece, The Low Spark of High-Heeled Boys. But in 1967, album-oriented rock was still not something that record company executives were delighted with. They were more happy at Island with some of the work that Dave Mason was doing. His first composition for Traffic, the single Hole in My Shoe, was actually a moderate-sized hit for the band. And again, this was something of a source of frustration. Not only was Mason working on his own, but he was mining more of a commercial trend than the rest of the band was pursuing. This continued throughout the sessions and ultimately resulted in Dave Mason's leaving Traffic before their first album, Mr. Fantasy, was released. As a result, the running orders on the UK and American versions of Mr. Fantasy are different. They contain different songs. In particular, the American version, which was released after the news was delivered that Dave Mason was no longer in the group, changed the content of the album to remove several of Dave Mason's songs and include the single Paper Sun, which was not in the UK running order. They also changed the cover photograph, choosing a photo that included just Winwood, Capaldi, and Wood without Mason. The Mr. Fantasy album was, while not a huge hit upon its first release, was a very influential record, with songs on the album being covered by numerous American artists. The song Heaven is in Your Mind, for example, was quickly covered by the American group Three Dog Night. Dealer, Jim Capaldi's solo song from the album, would ultimately be covered several years later by Carlos Santana's band. This was a trend that would continue on Traffic's second album as well. Interestingly, by the second album, Dave Mason had returned. Dave Mason in all would have 3 different stints with Traffic, one in 1967, again in 1968, and finally in the end of 1970 and into early 1971. Island Records obviously didn't want Mason to go away if they could help it, but ultimately Mason made the choice to leave permanently by 1971, he moved to California and began his solo career in earnest at that point. Even aside of Dave Mason, Traffic was somewhat unstable as a performing unit. It became clear after the completion of their second album that they might not last as a band for very much longer. Island Records, in order to make the money as they could from the band's recordings, quickly cobbled together a compilation album, the third album from the band called Last Exit, before it was announced that Traffic was breaking up for what would be the first time. Following this, Steve Winwood would join forces with Eric Clapton, Ginger Baker, and Rick Gretsch in the band Blind Faith. And following the breakup of Blind Faith, which only lasted for about 7 or 8 months, would continue to work for a while with Ginger Baker and Rick Gretsch, along with Chris Wood, in Ginger Baker's Air Force. By the early portion of 1970, though, after Air Force had broken up, Steve Winwood decided to pursue his first solo album in earnest. As he worked through the recording sessions, he began seeing opportunities for Capaldi and for Wood to participate and invited them to the sessions. This would result in the classic album John Barleycorn Must Die, which ultimately launched the second period of the albums that came from this period, also including The Low Spark of High Hill Boys and Shootout at the Fantasy Factory, were quite popular in the UK and particularly in the United States, where the band was embraced through the progressive rock radio that was burgeoning at this time, and also became notable for their live concerts, which featured very, very long jams. The band, however, continued to be somewhat unstable. Drug use plagued the band almost from the beginning, and in addition, various personal issues caused Chris Wood to become an alcoholic. Wood ultimately died due to alcoholism at a very early age, 39 years old, in 1983. Jim Capaldi fought heroin addiction for much of his life and also died at a fairly early age 60, in the year 2005. Steve Winwood is still with us and still is touring on a semi-regular basis, although he is in his 70s now. He's obviously had a fair amount of success following Traffic. In the late 1970s, Winwood began working rather vigorously as a solo artist, constructing albums where he was effectively the only performer on the album, using overdubs to play guitar, keyboards, drum machines, synthesizers, and of course provide vocals, and had a very strong career in the 1980s with albums like Arc of a Diver, Talking Back to the Night, and the massive hit Back in the High Life. So why is Traffic important to progressive rock? Well, there are a couple of reasons. From a musical perspective, Traffic were very much jazz-inflected and, as I mentioned, took something of a free-form, almost jam-like approach to their music. Winwood was once quoted as saying that oftentimes Traffic wouldn't even rehearse prior to a show. They'd get up on stage and just play, and if they played for 10 minutes before adding vocals to a song, that's how it went. They were often without structure and sometimes felt that that worked best for them, something that probably frustrated Dave Mason no end, I suspect. Progressive rock radio, in the United States especially, provided a great outlet for some of the longer compositions that the band would ultimately compose and perform. And in that regard, while Traffic perhaps isn't progressive rock in the same manner, what with shifting time signatures and classical influences, as bands like, for example, Yes, Emerson, Lake and Palmer and such. They were, in the early 1970s, clearly lumped into the prog rock category by most radio programmers. They had another influence too, and that was an indirect one, but one that was very important. The band being an early signing of a white rock band by Island Records helped to open the door for that label in the rock and roll business. Island would ultimately become a very influential, very successful independent label. In the 60s, Island would start building their roster with acts like, for example, Mott the Hoople and Spooky Tooth, and license those recordings to various American record labels for distribution. And when those records hit, those licenses would make Island very successful. Island, because of their success, was also a place where independent production companies might go to market their wares. One of the most notable of those, of course, was EG Management, which became EG Records, the home of Emerson, Lake and Palmer, King Crimson, and Roxy Music. So Traffic's putting Island on the map helped, at least indirectly, to put a lot of other people on the map too. That's all for this episode. Hope you enjoyed it. If you have any comments, of course, feel free to log those. We hope you enjoyed the show. If you did, feel free to click on like for the video. And of course, please subscribe. You'll be kept up to date with the remaining episodes in this series, as well as additional episodes that we pursue in the future. And there will be many. We are building a backlog of topics to talk about. Anyway, thanks again. You have a good one. Take good care.